I would just like to explain that as an anthropologist, I'm usually used to looking at things from the ground up, from observing actual behavior and so forth. So it was quite a switch for me to start working on this project about 4 years ago, because I'm not looking at what's actually happening on the ground. What I'm looking at is how people talk about what should be happening on the ground. So, you know, these are the ideals as they have evolved over the last 30 years in China in terms of bioethics discourse. Obviously, there should be some relationship between the discourse and the practice, but, you know, whether it's a very close relationship or very distant relationship is a little bit hard for me to say. So I apologize for not being able to come in and say, I witnessed so many IRBs, or the Chinese equivalent of IRB committees, and so forth. I can only tell you what people have told me are the problems that IRB committees have encountered. So with that caveat. I don't know how familiar people are with China historically, but bioethics has a very specific beginning in China. You can actually say, that was the day. And you might say, how can you be so precise? Well, certainly China historically has long had a field of medical ethics. So I'm not saying this is the first time Chinese encountered medical ethics. There are many books on the general topic of medical ethics, but looking at bioethics as it was narrowly understood in the 1970s and early 1980s as a response and an effort to deal with the problems raised by new medical technology, you can say that that really came to Chinese attention in 1979 when the Kennedy Institute of Ethics sent a delegation to Beijing, to Peking Union Medical College, to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and various other hospitals. And at that time, the Kennedy Institute of Ethics was one of the two major bodies that basically shaped bioethics, defined the field, as it were, in the United States. And I'm going to have to apologize. This is going to be a very American-centric perspective, and I'm sure you can help me find out how you Brits have been helping the Chinese think about some of these problems. It's also important to think of 1979 as the case because up until late 1978, China was still very much under Maoist influence. It had been essentially closed to most non-Soviet states, and it wasn't until the death of Mao, the decision to go forward with the four modernizations, which included science and technology, which obviously would include bioethics given its emphasis on medical technology, that China opened up and began to think about these things. And so it began to receive delegations from other countries. Shortly thereafter, it began, I'm not just talking about bioethics here, but you know, every field from physics, medicine, and later social science, to have people come in so that they could catch up. So they were very much in a catch-up mode. What have we missed since 1949 or even years earlier because of all of the turmoil in China? So with 1979, in comes this first delegation, and one of the first people to respond very favorably to this was a gentleman by the name of Qiu Renzong. I don't have his name here, but it's Qiu, Qiu Renzong, who at that time was at Peking Union Medical College, which is, he was at the Academy of Social Sciences and PUMC more or less at the same time, going back and forth between them. Peking Union Medical College, for those of you who don't know, maybe many of you do know, was established in the early part of the 20th century with Rockefeller Foundation money, and it had the specific purpose of bringing scientific medicine of the Western biomedical tradition to China. It was intended to become a large research institution, not a public health issue. I mean, not a public health provider. So it's, you know, it was controversial in its origins. But it continues to remain as the preeminent research institution with the most complex education in bioethics and in research medicine in general. So basically, the Chinese opened up and came out to find out what was going on. And this is hardly the first time that a society encounters a body of knowledge coming in from another society. And you have to keep in mind what was the history of the nature of contacts between China and the West before this. If you go back I'm not going to go all the way back, but if you go back into the mid 19th century, with the arrival of missionary medicine and so forth, it was very much a question of patriots beginning to be very self-conscious about foreigners bringing their ideas to us. So many people obviously very much embraced them, but other people were very concerned with the idea that how much foreign knowledge can we bring into our country without basically undermining our own values, our own system. So bioethics had to come in and, try to accommodate to that situation. And I think it would be fair to say that bioethics did not do that, at least not in its American form. We saw American bioethics as based on universal human values that should be obviously immediately embraced by everyone. And this was not quite the Chinese perspective on this. So you had people who were very responsive, oh, we need this new technology, we need these new ideas about this technology, and others saying, wait a minute, these are in some ways, and I'll talk a little bit more specifically later, these are not the kinds of values that we share, or at least partially not. Or if we do share some of them, can't we find aspects of our own tradition that would be just as good or even more helpful to us in understanding problems brought with the new medicine? So you've had people who were very eager to adopt, I wouldn't say uncritically, but less critically than others. You've had people who found it basically a nuisance, more hoops to run through, or foreigners want us to do this, and why should we have to do this? I mean, we know how to do medicine, we know how to treat patients, what's the big deal? And there were others who also argued it's an interesting field, but again, it's threatening to our core. Let's find something in our own history that we can use instead. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through the fact that the Chinese were not alone in trying, and Americans were hardly the only agency in trying to get bioethics started in China. So there were all kinds of players. There were international organizations, professional organizations, bilateral partners, Chinese domestic institutions as time evolved. And in terms of international organizations, and this is obviously going to be no surprise to any of you, the United Nations, through the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. They have an International Bioethics Committee. They have an Intergovernmental Bioethics Committee. And in 2005, which was obviously much after it was introduced to China, the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. So the Chinese, can't, they're not at a situation where there's a lack of resources for them to go to. And also, of course, the World Health Organization has an ethics and health initiative. In terms of professional organizations, the World Medical Association takes various stands on issues. There is also an International Bioethics Association, which is more narrowly focused on bioethics. In the 1990s, a lot of people in the medical field in many different countries in Asia were somewhat uncomfortable with the universalist claims that were coming out of the International Bioethics Association. And so they established the Asian Bioethics Association to try to look at ways these universal so-called principles could be adapted to an Asian context. And I think it's important to keep in mind that this debate within the Bioethics Association was going on side by side with the larger Asian values debate that was coming very much out of Singapore in terms of human rights, legal codes, and so forth. So that's reflected in the founding of the Asian Bioethics Association. There also, as I indicated, very early on, after 1979, the Chinese became interested in working with foreign partners. It's one thing to say, well, here are all of these committees and so forth, although not that they necessarily existed in the 1980s. Many of the ethics committees and so forth that I described on the previous slide were actually later developments, not there at the very beginning. But early bilateral partners were the National Institutes of Health in the United States. And actually, my husband and I we were on a trip to Yan'an in 1984, and we encountered a cancer researcher from NIH in the Yan'an airport, and he was just so excited to be doing cancer research at that time in China because there had been very little population movement, which meant, in a sense, if you picked particular locales, you could really control for dietary, environmental, and other kinds of influences, and maybe, you know, do a really good epidemiological study and maybe come to some conclusions. So the National Institutes of Health very early on was interested in carrying out research in China. And the Chinese were very interested in having research partners. We would be bringing in, obviously, the latest methodology, the latest technology, and so forth. But we also brought in a lot of research protocols. That is, all of a sudden, they had to start learning about institutional review boards. They had to start learning about informed consent, human subjects, all of these standard issues that have been of such great concern. So the National Institutes of Health was wonderful in one way, but on the other way, it just raised tons and tons of what were perceived, perhaps by some people, as hurdles. There was also the China Medical Board. I had earlier mentioned PUMC, Peking Union Medical College, as the institution founded by the Rockefeller Foundation. After the PRC was established, obviously the Rockefeller Foundation was not doing too much in China for quite some time, but it continued to exist in the form outside of China of the China Medical Board. And it's Rockefeller Foundation money, and it is very based in the US and very interested in promoting medical education in China, particularly in promoting professionalism. How do doctors come to think themselves as a profession? Which includes, things like establishing their own codes of ethics and being independent in a way of their employer, which in the case of China is rather difficult because the employer of most medical personnel is, of course, the state. So you're not quite independent. But in any case, the efforts are there. Also, there was the Dr. Helmut Storz Foundation in Germany. There is a German philosopher, I was surprised to discover he's actually quite a young man, Olli Düring, who in the mid and early 1990s became very active in China, attempting to run workshops and conferences that drew from all of the different provinces and to start developing a network of people who were interested in bioethical issues. And so he was very active for about 3 years, published very extensively in both German and English, so he would be a good source. In addition, over time, in terms of institutions working with bioethics, obviously would be Chinese domestic institutions, but it took a while for them to evolve. Obviously, at the top would be the Ministry of Health. Then you also have the Chinese Medical Association, which is the Association of Physicians. And more recently established, I believe, in 2007 or 2008, the Chinese Society of Bioethics. Now you might say, what's the difference between the Chinese Medical Association, particularly given that there was a specific ethics branch that already existed in the Chinese Medical Association? The Chinese Society of Bioethics was founded by a much more scholarly group. The Chinese Medical Association was primarily physicians, hospital administrators, and hospital administrators frequently included party members. So the discourse, the range of topics and what could be brought up in the ethics section of the Chinese Medical Association was perceived as too constrained by the more scholarly group. So they set out and established their own Society of Bioethics. And the gentleman whose name I mentioned at the beginning, Qiu Renzong, was one of the founders of the Chinese Society of Bioethics. Also, there are two publications, probably more, but two major publications in China that look specifically at issues of medical ethics. And one is Chinese Medical Ethics, comes out 6 times a year, and the whole book, the whole journal is on, in Chinese, is on issues. And if you were to go through the history of that journal, you would see how over time the discourse has changed, what different topics have been salient, what topics have fallen by the wayside. And there is also the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. There's one by the same name in English, but this is parentheses, Chinese Journal of Medicine and Philosophy. And it's very broad. I mean, it's not just ethics, but originally it had a small section in which it talked very specifically about medical ethics. And now it has expanded that. It doesn't have a separate little section. It's interwoven. The topic is interwoven throughout the journal. So there's plenty to read. In addition, when China became part of the Human Genome Research Center research project, they also had to develop a whole set of ethical, legal, and social implications. And this center has become very instrumental in looking at research ethics. And then finally, we have hospital ethics committees. China was familiar with these, and I was told as early as the 1990s that some hospitals had ethics committees. However, they were barely getting started. They didn't know, I mean, they knew they were supposed to be established because that was in the National Institute of Health regulations, but they really didn't know how do you constitute them, what are they really supposed to do. And for quite a long time, the assumption was that they were really only relevant if you were in a hospital involved in international research. In other words, if you're doing domestic research, did this still apply? And obviously, it does still apply, but it took a while to get to that. So looking at the major issues in bioethics in China, we have clinical issues, research issues, public health issues, and medical ethics education issues. And let's look at the clinical issues first. It is absolutely unbelievable how much attention is being given in China today to the doctor-patient relationship. That has been the number one, in terms of if you want to count the articles, the number one issue for at least the last 6 years. And it is obviously very closely related to the fallout from the various reforms that the healthcare system has undergone mostly in the 1990s. Depending on who you talk to, many different explanations are given for what is perceived to be a very problematic relationship. One argument has been that patients have a new sense of their rights. Now, one would think that's a good thing, but apparently it's not always a good thing when people start requiring, demanding services that the physician does not feel are appropriate. And this has led to quite dramatic attacks on doctors, beating them up. It has also led to many, many lawsuits that have hospitals in an absolute uproar. Others have argued that the strain in the relationship is not patient-generated, but much more on the side of the healthcare system generated. For example, the various reforms that have occurred that have restricted access in various ways. But worse, outside of the medical system, there have been a number of economic reforms that have put a lot of institutions that previously could rely on the central government for budgetary support. This is probably no surprise to people in Britain, but governments are cutting back in their support of medical institutions and in healthcare, although China has recently done another little flip-flop on that. But one of the most damaging, I would say, reforms is that hospitals have then been forced into the situation of trying to figure out new ways to make money. Some of these ways have been, I don't know whether you want to call them benign or not, but going into fields in which they know they can make money. Opening a new clinic for male ness. So, pills, better than Viagra, but, any kind of male problem in that general area, we'll have a specialty clinic for that because there's an inexhaustible market. And so that's a good way to make money. Cosmetic surgery, get the ladies in. So, there have been things like that done, but most people regard those things as relatively benign, if not fraudulent, but benign because people choose to go to these things. More damaging has been the fact that you have to pay up front, even if you have insurance in the hospital. And so people have arrived at the emergency room. I mean, it led to terrible things with, this traffic accident. Well, you don't call an ambulance. What you're supposed to do if there's a traffic accident in a rural area is pick up the person and run to the nearest hospital with them. But the hospital will then say, well, this patient can't be admitted for treatment until, they can put down a certain down payment on the cost. And, you know, the patient's unconscious, so he's not likely to come up with any money. And so you, the person who brought him in, whether you were a person walking by on the street or the perpetrator who knocked him off his bicycle, you are responsible for coming up with the money. Well, how many people now stop to pick up people that they hit off bicycles? You know, it's a disincentive to bring anybody to a hospital. So that was, I mean, they've since dealt with that. But, I mean, that was a terrible thing, obviously. But worse, once you're in the hospital, they then don't let you go. People were kept in and not let go until they could pay the bill. And so every day you're there that you can't pay the bill, they rack up more charges. I mean, and this was blown all over the paper. The media have, you know, been very helpful in exposing various kinds of scandals. So all of these kinds of things have fed into absolute distrust. You know, you're keeping me here, you're giving me this treatment, you're prescribing these medicines, and it's all just to make money. So it's a very contentious relationship. And it probably has very much not to do with patients' rights, but to do with the squeeze that hospitals feel themselves under. And actually, in 2006, the International Association of Bioethics held its biennial meeting in Beijing. And so it was sort of the coming of age. It was the coming out party for bioethics in China. I mean, it was very heavily, people from all around the world were on the program. But of course, this was an opportunity for Chinese to particularly demonstrate what they had done. So, you know, bioethics is out there in terms of talking, but this topic was very big at the bioethics conference and even got people yelling. How many of you are familiar with or have heard of the red packet or Hong Bao system of medicine? I see some people smiling. All right, this is illegal, but it was big in Hong Kong for years when I was doing my research in Hong Kong, and then it got flattened. They got rid of that. It's a little red envelope. If you celebrate, you know, Chinese New Year, you'll see Chinese adults give these to children or maybe to unmarried young adults, and they have a little money in them and so forth. So it's a bribe. And if you're going to have surgery in particular, you feel it's helpful to have the doctor on your side, so you slip him a red packet. Now, of course, these days it's a lot more than a red packet. And this has been a real source of tension. And in 2006, actually there was a shouting match in this. What are we talking about ethics when you guys are still accepting red packets? So bad stuff. So that's there. Assisted reproductive technology, quite controversial. Unless they've changed this very, very recently, surrogacy was eventually made illegal. Also, lots of concern with families not accepting as, that is the in-laws, not accepting as legitimate children, children who were born from sperm other than their, how to put it, sociological father. In other words, the father was infertile. They had to use somebody else's sperm to fertilize the wife. She has the baby. Keep that secret. And if the family found out, they might not accept that child. Obviously, the couple who had the child would accept it, but not the others. So a lot of issues around assisted reproductive technology, and not the kinds of issues that come up in the States. Another very controversial issue, and this is actually the one that I've pursued the most myself, is organ transplantation. Most of you are no doubt aware that China for years has been under international censure, condemnation, whatever, for using death penalty prisoners as a source of organs. And for a long time, the Chinese government firmly denied this. It was never discussed in print. And then all of a sudden, and I'd really like to know the story behind the story, in 1996, a researcher said it in print, not surprise, we're using prisoners, but rather, what are some of the problems in organ transplantation that we should be dealing with? And there's X and there's Y and there's Z, and then there's the prisoner issue and but he was very clever. He didn't say that it was an abusive system. He said he could imagine that there could be abuses. So they couldn't nail him for saying there were abuses. So they tippy-toed in to raising the topic. And then around 2003, the Ministry of Health, or a Vice Minister of Health, who was himself a liver transplant surgeon, made a public statement at an international meeting that, yes, we use prisoners. Of course, we get consent, but we'd like to move away from that. And if you want more information on that, I can discuss it a little bit further later. In 2006 and 2007, a whole new set of regulations and laws regulating organ transplantation was set about banning transplant tourism, encouraging living donation, but restricting, not wanting to get into the commercial aspects. I mean, wanting to be very sure they could avoid the buying and selling. So all kinds of issues around organ transplantation. End-of-life care. Really, just, certainly that's a high-tech field. And there is hospice care in China. It's pretty limited, and it's also very difficult as a topic to bring up because one shouldn't talk about death directly. And it's interesting because there's a kind of a split in this. Doctors shouldn't mention it, family members shouldn't mention it, and yet in the population that I studied when I was doing ground-up research, people who were in the rural areas thought the best thing you could do for your parent, and the one thing that you requested as a parent was, I want to be sure the coffin's already bought for me because I want to be buried with the coffin. And I want to be buried in these clothes. So you talked about the suit of clothes you were going to wear. You wanted to be sure you had a nice suit of clothes, and you wanted to have that coffin already stashed, in the backyard, ready to go, because the burial and the siting of the burial had all kinds of important implications for the family's future. I was told that, except in rural areas, that's generally gone out because they've gone to cremation, required, mandatory cremation. And also, even if you wanted to fake out the government, where are you going to stash a large coffin in those teeny-weeny apartments? So, did tradition do it? Did the government do it? Did the fact that they're urbanized do it? People don't do it that much anymore. But there still seems to be a gap between younger people's willingness to talk about death and older people's willingness, perhaps, to at least acknowledge that it's a real thing and it does happen to everybody at some point, so you should be prepared. Brain death, and this cycles back to both end-of-life care and organ transplantation. There is no formal rule on what brain death is, nor that you can certify somebody dead by brain death criteria. Yet, hospitals have their own criteria for discussing brain death, and if the person is dead, they can take them off dead by brain death, they can take them off life support, and pretty quickly they're dead by standard cardiopulmonary criteria. So the hospitals can sort of do it, but it's still controversial when you cycle it back into organ transplantation. In terms of research issues, what are people getting excited about? Well, I already mentioned the hospital ethics committees. And the basic problem, well, there are various problems, and one I talked about before was, what are they supposed to do? I mean, they don't meet regularly, generally speaking. The composition has been controversial. Now, people have proposed, composition, but the people generally are not trained. And in particular, one critic was telling me one of the most important functions of a hospital ethics committee when they're doing review, this is research on the hospital, not looking at clinical issues, is they really don't understand how to do risk-benefit ratios and the impact of this on the patient. And that in many cases, people on these committees were not at all clear in the difference between a therapeutic extension of, let's say, something that's already known versus an experimental in the research sense. And so, they really didn't know how to respond in a lot of cases. So the composition, in many cases, as I said, the leading hospital administrator, who is usually a party member, is on there. And if he says, looks good to me, it's very difficult to challenge that. I mean, hierarchy is important not just in the communist system, that's also important in the traditional system in China. So if the leader has indicated approval, and he may have approved it in ignorance or quite well informed, who knows, it's just very hard for other people to raise objections. So, of course, one of the suggestions has been to move these people off the committee so that they can be more truly independent. All right, and the other issue has been a major issue, and of course there are a gazillion little issues that would fit under research conduct. But there have been a number of scandals in the medical area, some of which, were known but suppressed, and finally blown open so that people became aware of them. Some of you are probably familiar with the Henan blood scandal. The whole situation of AIDS being spread to a lot of people who were donating blood. The plasma was taken and mixed up, and the blood got contaminated. I'm going to give the wrong word, but anyway, that which was re-injected into the patient was contaminated, and they just had a colossal AIDS epidemic and at these various blood centers. And it took a very courageous doctor to say, this has to become known, this has to stop. And she did not get heavily censured. I think she was already past retirement age, so there wasn't much they could do to her. But they've restricted her travel. She was supposed to get an award abroad, and they wouldn't let her go abroad. Other scandals, there was a big Harvard scandal in Anhui province. That ultimately was cleared up and found to be perhaps no fault, but it had to do with, were the subjects of an asthma research protocol aware of the nature of the risks to using this medication? Or did they think that they were going to be getting actual treatment, when in fact there was nothing that said you're getting treatment? So were they in a way, a true failure of informed consent? Was there deliberate misleading, or did they just not understand? And anyway, that eventually blew over, but it certainly got people thinking. Well, I mean, if you've seen some of these consent forms, you know that they can be somebody who's not even a physician but is well educated in a Western country can't figure out what the heck is going on here. And you don't read it anyway. You just say, oh, okay, sure. Just like this form I was asked to sign. Will I read it? Wait a minute. So, all kinds of problems in that direction. There was another problem, I guess, in Ditan Hospital in Beijing, in which, again, there was a misunderstanding in terms of informed consent. But these are things that become public, and these are things that became known in large urban hospitals or in international collaborative. Again, what is going on in smaller places? Do people even know what they're doing is incorrect? Very, very difficult to know. There is, for example, and this is not in a small rural area, but there is a gentleman working on stem cell therapy for Parkinson's disease. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this person, who is working in the general area of Beijing, runs his own private hospital offering stem therapy. For Parkinson's, he has people coming in from all over the world. One of my own graduate students' brothers went to this place, and he's been told, there's no evidence. We're supposed to be practicing evidence-based medicine, and there's no evidence that this works. And he has responded with, it would be unethical for me to do a trial, because this is the only therapy there is. So, seems not quite right. Okay, public health issues. Access to health care. This has been more or less perpetual. There's been a lot of idealization of what kind of health care was available under Mao in rural areas. We were talking very much primary health care. People weren't going off under rural insurance to have heart surgery. So, don't overestimate what was being done. But in terms of access to basic level care, trauma care, and so forth, they certainly had that. But that vanished for a long time in the countryside with the disbanding of the communes and the turn to individual level farming. Gradually, things have come back. Basically, catastrophic health care of a kind has come back in the rural areas, and they're also trying to implement in some experimental zones slightly more inclusive kinds of health care. But this isn't an area that I have pursued myself, so I'm not sure how universal these changes have become. And in the urban area, people used to get their health care strictly through their work unit, but increasingly they are now getting portable health care, they are putting money in themselves and so forth, so they're trying to reform that. But when a lot of work units, factories and so forth went bankrupt, they simply stopped paying health care to their pensioners. They stopped paying their pensions too, by the way. And you had terrible rows with retired people, particularly in northeast China, demonstrating all over the place. And the government really feeling, what could they say? They really couldn't say anything. These people had played by the rules and they just got caught. So they had to work out ways to that. And then the whole resource allocation issue, always there. In the Chinese case, again, how much do you put, even Mao was concerned about this. How much do you put into urban? How much do you put into rural? How much do you put into research versus how much do you put into making general treatment available? And how much do you put into the healthcare system at all compared to other systems? And this is currently, in terms of money being put into hospitals and so forth, they're trying to alleviate the problems that came up that I described before of hospitals having to be very creative to make up for the budgets that they lost. So they're now trying to allocate better. Medical ethics education, a number of issues. Quality of teaching. Basically, when the first generation is not well trained, how do they train? So there have been constant efforts to try to get people who are trained in teaching medical ethics, which is more inclusive than, bioethics has expanded from obviously limiting itself to problems generated by new technology in the clinical relationship to the whole clinical relationship. And not every doctor thinks that bioethics should be sticking its nose in there. So there's quality of teaching, and there is student interest. I talked to a number of people who are teaching in the medical schools, and they said, and maybe you find the same, students aren't interested. What does this do? This isn't going to help us pass an exam. And it's an elective. It may now have been made mandatory in some institutions, but basically it was an elective, and once made mandatory, that didn't help. People sat there looking bored, and they've tried to get away from, again, lots of problems in standard pedagogy. They've tried to move away from, straight lectures to problem-solving based ethics training. And, perhaps that will make a difference and engage people more, but that has been a serious problem. And then finally, there has been a lot of cynicism about the actual impact of a class on ethics, on behavior, that most of the behavior is learned by role modeling. And if the people that you are following around in the hospital and learning your in-hospital training skills from are behaving inappropriately, accepting red packets, for example, although they wouldn't do it right in front of you, how do you, if you don't practice what you preach, basically, how can you be effective in installing the right values in the population of doctors? So lots of concerns with what are they learning behavior. And I remember interviewing one guy who was a psychiatrist but needed health care, and so he was in line at the hospital, and nobody knew that he was anybody except for the fact that he was a Westerner, which is a little bit odd. So he's sitting there in line with everybody else, and they all had to be, I don't know what, they had to get spread out on some kind of machine, imaging machine, and get something done. And so one patient came in, a heavy guy in a wheelchair being pushed by his wife, and they get to the machine, it's their turn to get up, and she's trying to help this almost obese guy out of the wheelchair, and she can't do it. He's too heavy, and he's sick, so he can't really contribute much to pulling his own weight out. technicians there, doctors there, nobody offers to help at all. And so finally, this other patient, the Western doctor, got up and helped get the guy out of the chair. And, you know, as he's telling me this, and it happened quite some time ago, he was livid. You know, how are they going to learn anything about ethics when this is what they actually see on the floor, in the lab, whatever, you know? So teaching is nothing. It's you've got to see what's going on. So a lot of questions there. Now, as I said, medical ethics has existed in China for a long time, including, more recently, socialist medical ethics. And this is, I consider this book precious. It's precious because I think it marks the end of socialist ethics in China and the beginning of bioethics. The next book that comes out in 1987, not by these same authors, is the first book to ever use the term bioethics in China. And let's just look at some of the chapters in here. Socialist medical ethics training, socialist medical ethics for education, socialist medical ethics. They're very didactic. I'll spare you, you know, any content. Socialist medical ethics research. In 1984, Renee Fox and Judith Swayze published a very interesting article called "Medical Morality Isn't Bioethics." And medical morality is basically how it was discussed during the socialist era in China. And it referred primarily to doctor-patient relationships. And they used that, they observed medical practice in a major hospital in Tianjin for about a month. And they had previously observed all kinds of behavior. I mean, they write on organ transplantation in the United States. And so they went with a very good grounding, shall we say, in practice in American hospitals to this leading hospital in Tianjin in North China. And they were impressed by what they found, but they were very clear, and I think they were writing for those same people from Georgetown University who visited in 1979. You know, medical morality, which is what they called it, what the Chinese themselves called their medical ethics, medical morality, it's not bioethics. And they launched into a really very biting critique of the cultural narrowness of Western bioethics. And they didn't come to any conclusions, but they just wanted all of these American advocates of bioethics to understand that they were, you know, you couldn't just carry these assumptions in. But this was what they saw going on. I mean, and they were not critical of this. They were perhaps idealized this situation very much. I mean, they would say, wow, you go into the hospital and you can't tell the difference. You know, there's no marking in the uniforms of who's what and so forth. It's very egalitarian. What they use for training is role models. And they would have, you know, a model worker, a model doctor, and what were the principles that this person illustrated, and they paraded this person around. And I'm afraid a month is not enough to get people out of their best behavior. So I'm not saying they necessarily saw the best that they could see. I mean, I think they saw the best that they could see. All right, 2 years later, here's Qiu Renzong. This is the same person I mentioned before. He's basically regarded by the foreign community, I would say, as the father of bioethics, because he is an English speaker. He is the face of bioethics to outsiders. He also even went to the Kennedy Institute of Ethics, I think in 1989. And so this is, you see what were the issues at that time. So no socialist anything here. And I should add that the Shanghai People's Press was sort of given the responsibility of introducing foreign ideas, you know, of new technology and everything else to the Chinese community. So this is a synthesis. I mean, he read tons of works and synthesized because he's presenting the ideas, not critically, but just presenting the ideas. And so here were the issues that were big at that time, middle 1980s. Behavior control, you might think, wow, sounds pretty calming. But what they meant by that, this is mental health, actually. How to deal with mental health difficulties. All right, thereafter, a slew of medical ethics came out. This is a typical book that a student in the 3rd year of medical education would be getting in China. So this is, back. A full array. So it's not just doctors, it's also pharmaceutical work, health administration, nursing. Is that a question? I'm sorry. No. Okay. Whoops, I should probably wind it up. All right. One more big one. This is intended for major researchers. This is by, you see the name Cho Ren-zung up there, but also Jai Xiaomei. Both of them are at Peking Union Medical College. Jai is one of Cho's former students. She is extremely active also in international circles, attended, I should have mentioned, a lot of the bilateral training included sending English-speaking Chinese to the United States. Some went to Chicago, some went to Harvard to get training, and some went to Georgetown, obviously. So, you know, the ones that the foreign community sees are the people who are working in English. And yet there is a whole other set of people working in bioethics in China who are not English speakers, and somehow they never get brought out. Okay. All right, Chinese responses: embrace, reject, compromise. I sort of mentioned that already, moving right along. Whoa, I don't know that I did that. I didn't intend for that to happen. Oh, please. How did I accidentally hit that? All right. We're talking about learning for alternatives. You know, we don't have to talk about individual rights. We don't have to talk about autonomy. I mean, we can deliver good patient care and clean research, perhaps using other models. And it's been a mystery to me, frankly, that when the Chinese have all kinds of models that they could draw on, or other philosophical systems that they could draw on, that they do so in a very limited way. I mean, first of all, as I said, there are those who just say, yes, the universal ethical principles are universal and they apply to China, end of story. But there are others who have argued, you know, let's look at our own tradition. And there is a tradition. They have some wonderful socialist models. I mean, some of you may be familiar with Norman Bethune. He was a Canadian physician who worked in Yan'an for the communists in the 1930s and died as the result of a blood infection acquired while treating wounded Chinese soldiers. And so he gave his life in the most wonderful, international, comradely way. So his spirit is, historically at least, I mean during the socialist era, was always being invoked. You know, so why can't we go back and talk a little bit about we should all behave like Dr. Norman Bethune and sacrifice and so forth. There's also another potential model, Dr. Lu Wenting. This is a fictional model, however. And it's a very interesting novella that appeared in 1979 in which she was long suffering, sacrificed her family in many ways, but nevertheless served the people. And she also was interested in bringing in modern Western technology to serve the people better. So she was an interesting character. On the one hand, she represented socialist values. On the other hand, you could bring in modern technology. It's not disloyal to say we want better products to cut people up than we're getting from our Chinese factories where the knife breaks in your hand. You know, not good for surgery. So, but no, she's not used either. And instead, what has happened is people have gone, those who have attempted to look at the Chinese tradition, have drawn most heavily on Confucianism, arguing that, you know, Confucianism looks at the whole family. And this is brought up particularly in issues of medical decision-making. If the culture says we don't like to tell people that they're dying, doctors frequently do not tell patients that they have terminal cancer. They'll tell the family and leave it up to the family to tell. But then, you know, how much should the family play a role in medical decision-making? And so on and so forth. So they look at that. They also look at harmony. They see the rights-based approach of Western ethics as facilitating conflict. I mean, actually stating it. The assumption in a contract is you can't be trusted. You don't want to start with that. You want to start with we have a common goal. So focus on harmony. Hierarchy. That is sometimes used positively, sometimes negatively. Critics have argued we can't use Confucianism because it is hierarchical. And we shouldn't use Confucianism because it talks about, I don't think it uses this precise terminology, but graded love, that you have obligations to those close to you, and the further away they are, the less the obligation. And what are the implications of that for inclusion? And that has been fought back with people saying, no, 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 that's a primitive view of Confucianism, that a truly ethical person understands that all humanity is part of one great system and that one can, in fact, extend beyond this gradation. The Confucian move actually has been made less in China and more in Hong Kong. It's Chinese in Hong Kong, some of whom are from the mainland, who have pushed a Confucian idea. And I would say over the last 10 years, that has also gained ground in China. It's become much more acceptable to appeal to Confucianism. So the socialist model, we're just skipping 30 years of history. Absent from discussion, anything from Buddhism. Hey, Buddhism, compassion, relieving suffering, Buddhist medicine, very important coming into China. And yet, presumably, because it doesn't have the scholarly cachet of Confucianism, it's not something that most scholars will turn to. Also, Confucianism historically was very much a model for a political official to follow. And, we have political officials there today in China who are, we're in charge, we like to make the rules. But Buddhism is a religion. And it would be awkward for a communist regime to be openly out there promoting religious values. I mean, it's just a little bit of a contradiction. So I think I'd better stop. I think I've run out of my time. Good. Okay.